The wool sat in a heap against the fence post, soaked black with something that wasn't rain. And Sadie Callahan knelt beside it with her bare hands pressed flat into the fibers, feeling the water pull away from her skin while the oil stayed behind. Behind her, Dale Hargrove stood with his arms crossed and his jaw set, watching a 13-year-old girl do something with his ruined wool that he hadn't been able to do with a shop rag and a case of degreaser. Nobody said a word for a long moment. Then Hank Whitfield knelt down next to her, pressed his thumb into the wet mat, and asked her to explain it again from the beginning. But before the county extension agent ever came out to that fence line, before Dale Hargrove's face changed from disgust to disbelief, there was a pile of wool nobody wanted and a girl who wouldn't leave it alone. She wasn't loud about it. She wasn't looking for anyone's approval. She had one clear reason for what she was doing, and she kept it to herself. Sadie Callahan was 13 years old, and she lived on her grandfather's farm in Wexford County, Kentucky, along the low ground where Coldwater Creek cut through the back pasture. If stories about turning what everyone else throws away into something the whole county ends up needing keep you coming back, subscribe and join us every day. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. The Callahan place had been shrinking for years, not in acreage, but in ambition. Walter Callahan was 68 now, his beard trimmed close and gray under a straw hat he'd owned longer than most of his neighbors had been alive. He still ran cattle, still mended fence, but his knees told him when to stop, and lately they told him more often than he liked. His wife Eleanor had been gone 3 years, and the only place she still spoke from was a leather-bound ledger kept in the kitchen drawer, its pages filled with her handwriting, wool oil, 3 parts. Lanolin, tallow rendered soft, notes she'd written when she still ran 12 sheep on the hillside above the creek. Sadie had found the ledger the winter after Eleanor died, and she'd been reading it in pieces ever since, the way some kids read comic books, looking for the parts that made her grandmother feel close again. Some pages were recipes. Some were just weather notes, frost dates and rainfall totals going back 15 years. But every so often she'd land on something written in a hand that felt like it was talking directly to her. Half-finished thoughts about the sheep Eleanor used to keep, the smell of lanolin on cold mornings, the particular ache of hauling wet fleece up from the creek. That spring, she found the page about wool. Down the road, the Hargrove brothers ran a sheep operation twice the size of anything the Callahans had ever kept. 40 head on good pasture, sheared twice a year by a crew that came through with electric clippers and a flatbed trailer. Dale Hargrove was heavyset and loud about it, the kind of man who wore his ball cap low and his opinions louder. His brother Roy was leaner, quieter, but no less sure of himself. And between the two of them, they'd built a reputation for running their place clean and their mouths cleaner. This spring's shearing had gone wrong from the start. A wet winter had left half the fleece matted with mud and manure, the kind of low-grade wool no wool buyer in 3 counties would touch. Rather than pay to haul it off, Dale had dumped it in a pile behind the equipment shed. 40 pounds of it at least, figuring it would rot down into something useful for mulch eventually, or just sit there, being nobody's problem. Sadie saw the pile on a Tuesday, riding past on her bike with a bag of feed balanced on the handlebars. She stopped. She didn't ask permission. She just started pulling handfuls of the cleaner wool from the top of the heap, stuffing it into a feed sack. While Dale watched from his porch with an expression that said he thought she'd lost her mind. "You want that mess? You're welcome to it," he called out. "Won't clean up worth a nickel." She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She simply kept doing the one thing everyone told her not to, hauling 3 sacks of rejected wool back to the Callahan barn over the course of a week, ignoring the smell, ignoring the looks from anyone who happened to pass. Walter found her sorting it on the barn floor that Saturday. separating the worst of the manure-caked clumps from wool that still had some life left in it. "Your grandmother used to say the good stuff and the garbage looked the same in the dark," he told her, settling onto an overturned bucket with the slow care of a man whose knees had opinions about sitting down. Took her a long time to learn to tell them apart in the daylight, too. Eleanor's ledger held the answer, or at least the start of one. Wash the wool in cool water first, never hot. Hot water felts it before you want it felted. Work in a solution of mild soap, rinse twice. Lay it to dry on a wire rack in the shade, never direct sun. Sadie followed the instructions to the letter, filling a stock tank with creek water and working batch after batch through it with her hands, wringing out the gray water. Laying the clean wool across a rack Walter helped her build from scrap 2x4s and chicken wire, set up in the shade of the old oak 20 feet from the equipment shed. It took her the better part of 2 weeks to process what she'd hauled home, and by the end of it, she had maybe 15 pounds of usable fleece, softer and cleaner than anything Dale Hargrove had thrown away. She didn't have a plan for it yet. She just knew Eleanor wouldn't have let it rot in a pile behind somebody's shed. The accident happened on a Thursday afternoon in June. Walter had been running the old tractor along the fence line, and a hydraulic hose split without warning, spraying a thin sheet of amber fluid across 6 feet of grass before he got the engine shut down. He swore under his breath, more annoyed than alarmed, and went to fetch rags from the shed, the kind of small mechanical failure that happens on a working farm 2 or 3 times a season. Sadie had a rack of wool drying not 30 feet away. By the time Walter came back with an armful of shop towels, she was crouched at the edge of the spill with a double handful of raw wool pressed into the wet grass, and something about the way the fluid was behaving had stopped her cold. The water in the ground stayed where it was. The oil didn't. It climbed into the wool fibers instead, dark and visible against the pale fleece, while the grass beneath stayed damp but clear. "Grandpa, look at this." She held up a fistful of oil-soaked wool, and beneath it, the ground was noticeably lighter than it should have been. Walter crouched down slow, pressed 2 fingers into the grass where she'd worked the wool through, and came away with fingers that were nearly clean. He didn't say much right then. He just told her to keep at it and see what happened, which was as close to blessing as Walter Callahan gave anybody's half-formed idea. The first real test came 3 days later, and it went badly. Sadie packed a mat of raw wool too loosely into a mesh bag, dropped it onto a smaller test spill Walter helped her stage in an old feed pan, and watched the whole thing soak up water right along with the oil, defeating the purpose entirely. A second attempt went the other direction, packed so dense the fluid barely penetrated the surface before running off the sides. She sat on the barn floor that evening with wool scattered around her in 3 failed configurations, and something close to frustration on her face. Eleanor's ledger didn't have an answer for this one. Wool had never needed to separate oil from water back when Eleanor was keeping her own sheep. But it had notes on felting density, how tight to pack raw fleece for a saddle pad versus a floor mat. And Sadie started reading those pages differently. Not as instructions for making something soft, but as a guide to how much air a given weight of wool could hold. She landed on it by the 4th try, a loosely felted mat, maybe 2 inches thick, wool layered and lightly compressed by hand rather than packed tight or left airy, wrapped in a mesh onion sack Walter had saved from the feed store. Dropped onto a test spill, it soaked the oil into the fiber within a minute, floated instead of sank, and when she lifted it clear, the water underneath tested clean enough that Walter dipped a finger in and tasted it without a second thought. She made 6 more that week, refining the layering each time, learning by feel how many handfuls of wool a mat needed before it stopped absorbing water it didn't want, and started holding onto oil the way it should. Some batches came out uneven, thick on one side and thin on the other, and those she pulled apart and reworked rather than waste the wool. Walter started keeping a rough count on a scrap of paper nailed to the barn wall: mat number, thickness in inches, minutes to saturation, the kind of record-keeping Eleanor would have approved of, even if he'd never admitted out loud. Word moved slow at first, and then all at once. The way it does in a county where everybody's business eventually becomes everybody's business. Roy Hargrove mentioned it to a man at the feed store, half joking, said the Callahan girl was making floor mats out of his brother's garbage wool. The feed store owner mentioned it to Hank Whitfield, the Wexford County extension agent, who'd been in the job less than a year and was still looking for reasons for farmers to trust him. Hank drove out on a Wednesday morning unannounced, found Sadie behind the barn with 4 finished mats laid out on sawhorses to dry, and asked her to walk him through it from the start. She did, the ledger open on a hay bale beside her, showing him Eleanor's notes on wool density next to her own scrawled additions in pencil. He tested one himself, dripping diesel fuel from his own truck onto a patch of gravel and setting one of Sadie's mats over it, timing the absorption with the stopwatch on his phone. 90 seconds to full saturation. He pressed his thumb into it the way he had at that first fence line meeting weeks later when word had spread further and it came away dry. "Raw wool's got lanolin in it," he told her, more to himself than to her, working it out loud. "Hydrophobic. Repels water, pulls oil right in. There's actual research on this. Commercial oil spill booms use it now on coastlines. You built a version of it in your grandmother's barn with garbage wool and a mesh sack." The real test came a month later, when Roy Hargrove's own tractor sprang a hydraulic leak in the equipment shed, spreading across the concrete floor faster than shop rags could keep up with. Dale, out of options and low on pride, sent Roy down the road to ask if the Callahan girl still had any of those mats. She did. 4 of them, laid across the spill, pulled most of the fluid clear inside 20 minutes, saving the Hargroves a call to a commercial cleanup service that would have run them close to $400 for a job that size. Dale Hargrove stood in his own equipment shed, holding a wool mat gone dark with the oil he'd have paid a company to clean up. And he didn't say much. He didn't need to. He drove over that weekend with a fresh load of rejected wool from this year's shearing, the good stuff this time, sorted and separated, and set it just inside the Callahan barn door without being asked. Hank Whitfield started recommending the wool mats to other farmers in the county that same month, a low-cost fix built from material most operations threw away anyway. Sadie never set out to prove anybody wrong. She just followed what her grandmother had written down and let a hydraulic leak show her the rest. Wendell Berry once wrote that the soil is the great connector of lives, the source and destination of all. Sadie's harvest that spring wasn't measured in pounds or dollars. It was a pile of garbage wool nobody wanted, turned into something the whole county came looking for, one mat at a time. What's a piece of old family knowledge that turned out to matter more than you expected? Tell us in the comments below. And if this is the kind of story that stays with you, subscribe and join us every day for another one. If you'd like to go deeper into stories like this one, we've got an ebook waiting for you in the description below. We'll see you tomorrow with another story from Wexford County.